Hello and welcome, I'm Thomas Porteous and you're watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories. Around 30 world leaders meet Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to discuss security guarantees if a ceasefire with Russia is reached. The coalition of the willing includes European nations, Turkey, Australia and Canada as they seek to win US support. Israeli leaders dismiss a Hamas offer to free all hostages in exchange for ending the war in Gaza, vowing to push ahead with their planned invasion of Gaza City. The move follows Hamas's ceasefire proposal and President Trump's demand that the remaining captives be released. The Trump administration asks the US Supreme Court to fast-track its appeal after a lower court rules against the president's tariffs. Solicitor General John Sauer warns delay is damaging trade talks and urges oral arguments by November. Portugal is in shock after 15 people die and 18 are injured when Lisbon's 140-year-old Gloria funicular derails, a major tourist attraction in the capital. Officials declare a day of national mourning as the mayor calls it a tragic moment for the city. Survivors of Jeffrey Epstein share emotional testimonies on the steps of the US Capitol, urging lawmakers to release more files from the investigation. One victim says they are compiling a confidential list of associates linked to the abuse done by survivors and for survivors. The Israeli military says a missile fired from Yemen lands in an open area outside its territory, the third such launch in 24 hours. This comes as the Iran-backed Houthi rebels step up missile and drone attacks, calling them acts of solidarity with Palestinians. A top UAE official warns that any Israeli annexation of the West Bank would cross a, quote, red line and end the vision of regional integration. Emirati envoy Lana Nusaybeh says such a move would kill the two-state solution, sounding an alarm ahead of the Abraham Accords anniversary. Venezuelan Interior Minister Diosdado Cabello accuses the United States of committing 11 extrajudicial killings after US forces strike a speedboat. Washington says the vessel belongs to the trendy Aragua gang and was carrying drugs, with President Donald Trump sharing the video of the explosion online. We start in West Asia, where, according to reports, Israeli leaders have dismissed a statement from Hamas declaring its willingness to free all hostages in exchange for ending the war in Gaza. Israel is planning to move ahead with its planned offensive in Gaza City, with the Israeli Defense Forces preparing to deploy more troops on the ground in western Gaza. Hamas had earlier agreed to enter into a comprehensive deal with Israel involving a prisoner exchange from both sides. Meanwhile, the Israeli Prime Minister's office has stated that the war can only end if all 5 of Israel's conditions are met. These include the release of all hostages, the disarmament of Hamas, the demilitarization of the Gaza Strip, Israeli security control in Gaza, and the establishment of an alternative civilian administration that does not indoctrinate for terror, does not dispatch terror, and does not pose a threat to Israel. We're now joined by Dr. Emmanuel Navon. He is an international relations lecturer at Tel Aviv University and senior fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. He joins us live from Tel Aviv now. Thank you very much, Dr. Navon, for joining us here on NewsX World and for taking the time. Israel has dismissed Hamas's proposal as quote-unquote more spin while intensifying operations in Gaza City. Do you think this risks undercutting the possibility of a ceasefire and even one that could save hostages?
Well, the purpose is not a ceasefire. The purpose is victory. And what Hamas is offering is not Israel's victory. Hamas wants to stay in power. Hamas doesn't want to lay down its arms. And Hamas wants Israel to completely withdraw from the Gaza Strip. This is not acceptable for Israel. Israel is fighting this war to make sure that the threat of October 7 can never repeat itself again. And that means that Hamas has to immediately release all our hostages, lay down its arms, the leadership has to leave the Gaza Strip, and Israel has to be in military control of that territory in the months and the years to come. What Hamas is offering, as I said, is not Israel's victory, and Israel will not end the war before total victory.
Dr. Navon, Hamas accepted a 60-day ceasefire weeks ago now, including hostage exchange provisions, which Israel has yet to respond to. Could rejecting that deal be seen as rejecting diplomacy, and how do you think that is going to fees for long term in this war?
Regarding the long term, obviously we will have to plan the future of the Gaza Strip together with our partners. But before the long term is the short and mid-term. And that is, as I said, the fact that Hamas is still in control of parts of the Gaza Strip, that it still prevents the distribution of humanitarian aid provided by Israel, that it terrorizes the civilian population, that it threatens civilians not to move from combat areas. And therefore, in the short term, before diplomacy, we need, as I said before, military victory. Diplomacy, the purpose of diplomacy is to ensure stability and peace among actors in a region. But before you have that, you need victory. This is exactly what happened after World War II. First you had total victory, and then you had diplomacy and peace.
Yes, and finally, Dr. Navon, we all see the images coming out of Gaza with the international community, many of Israel's traditional allies horrified by this situation on the ground, including President Donald Trump, who's released statements about that. With tens of thousands of children displaced and widespread destruction in Gaza, how does Israel justify the human cost of, quote, flattening a city, which the defense minister has claimed that he's going to do unless these conditions are met, when non-military alternatives have been offered in regard to this 60-day ceasefire deal?
You know, we are marking the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. I invite you to look at the pictures of German and Japanese cities in 1945. How do we justify it? We have been attacked by a jihadist and genocidal movement that intends to destroy the state of Israel in coordination with Iran. That's how we justify it. We are defending ourselves. And yes, war is cruel. It entails destruction. We did not choose that war. It was imposed on us. This war has to be won. Obviously, the pictures are horrible, but the ultimate responsibility for this tragedy is Hamas. It is Hamas that started this war with Iran. It is Hamas that committed these atrocities on October 7, and now Israel has to defend itself. War is cruel. It entails destruction and death. That is a tragedy. But at the end of the day, Israel is justified to defend itself, and it will defend itself, and it will do so until total victory. We are aware of the cost in the meantime, but we will fight and continue this war until victory, no matter what.
Dr. Emmanuel Navon, thank you very much for joining us and for taking the time. We now move on and over to the United States, where President Donald Trump has asked the US Supreme Court to overturn a lower court's decision that found many of his sweeping tariffs illegal. In a petition filed in the Supreme Court, the Trump administration asked the justices to quickly intervene to rule in the matter. Trump reiterated his stance that rescinding the tariffs would be very costly. President Trump also talked about the losses if the administration loses the case in the Supreme Court. Let's take a listen in to what he had to say.
We're in a much better position. We have trillions of dollars coming into our country. If we didn't have tariffs, we would be a very poor nation, and we would be taken advantage of by every other nation in the world, friend and foe. We're not going to let that happen. And we have a very, very big case in the Supreme Court. I can only say this. Our country has a chance to be unbelievably rich again, but it can also be unbelievably poor again. If we don't win that case, our country is going to suffer so greatly.
What's the backup plan, sir?
But I think we're going to have a big victory.
Although trade experts note that the duties are paid by importers in the United States and not companies in the countries of origin, economists have warned that the tariffs are likely to fuel inflation in the United States. We're now joined by Dr. Jayjit Bhattacharya. He's an economist and a finance expert, and he joins us live from the Indian capital of New Delhi. Jayjit, thank you very much. Pleasure to talk to you as always. Donald Trump wants the Supreme Court to quickly decide on this decision in regards to his tariffs. He wants it sped up through the highest court in the land. How serious is this case for the United States and also for global trade?
Tariff has been the centerpiece of Trump's push towards restructuring what he believes is an unfavorable trade regime for the US. And clearly he has taken a very quick set of very, very significant steps using tariff, which has led to a widespread disruption in global trade. We have had complete linkages being stopped, job losses happening, significant business losses happening, and there has been pain with the US consumers. The long-term belief of the US administration is that that will lead to somehow manufacturing coming back to the US, although we haven't had any data really backing that up as of now. Of course, it's early days to say that. Now, in that context, if the Supreme Court actually overturns the judgment of the previous court and of the lower courts that the tariffs imposed by the president of US is beyond his powers because there is no financial emergency, which is the context in which this was invoked, then the tariffs go away. Then the US starts following what is right under the WTO regime, because all these tariffs that has been imposed are against the WTO regime. And US is a signatory. In fact, it crafted the WTO regime. And hence, if that goes away, then the cornerstone of Trump's policymaking goes away. Of course, it also brings relief to the rest of the world and to the US consumers and to the US businesses, which have been struggling to find their supply chain at a relevant cost. So there are going to be very significant repercussions if the Supreme Court accepts or overturns both ways the tariffs that the US president has put in. Also, do keep in mind that most of the judges have been appointed by the Trump administration in the Supreme Court. So there are chances possibly that the Supreme Court may overturn what the previous court had passed, which was till date that the Trump administration had overstepped its power to impose the tariffs.
Jayjit, obviously this has been Donald Trump's defining trade policy. He uses much weight when it comes to describing these tariffs, saying the United States will suffer greatly if these tariffs do disappear. He said what we've just heard, that the United States will become very poor if these tariffs do disappear. Do you agree with this, or do you think this is exaggerated?
Well, we have not heard the president of the US explaining why he said what he said, that the Americans will become poor if the tariffs are taken away. In the short run, the tariffs were actually making the Americans poor because the tariffs were being paid by the Americans only. And so therefore they have been becoming poorer than what they were earlier. In the long run, if the thesis is that it will lead to more jobs in the US and therefore somehow the Americans will become richer, that is again not backed by economic analysis, because those jobs can come in only if the Americans accept a salary level which is anywhere between 1/5 to 1/10 of their current salary levels, which will clearly not be acceptable. So if they accept those salary levels, then they will be poorer any which ways. So we are not really sure what is it that the president of US meant when he said the Americans will turn poorer if the tariffs go away. If the tariffs go away, goods will be cheaper, and hence, by logic, they should be better off than actually becoming poorer.
Jayjit, do stay with us as we discuss further tariff updates. The US president has also signaled that Phase 2 and Phase 3 of sanctions targeting India are still to come. This follows the initial move to impose secondary sanctions over its continued purchases of Russian oil. The US has imposed a 50% tariff on India's purchases of Moscow's oil, which includes a 25% reciprocal tariff and an additional 25% duty for the oil imports, effective since August the 27th. Let's listen in to Trump's statements.
Okay. How do you know there's no action? Would you say that putting secondary sanctions on India, the largest purchaser outside of China, they're almost equal, would you say there was no action? That cost hundreds of billions of dollars to Russia. You call that no action? And I haven't done Phase 2 yet or Phase 3. But when you say there's no action, I think you ought to get yourself a new job. Because if you remember, 2 weeks ago I said, if India buys, India's got big problems. And that's what happened. So don't tell me about that. Go ahead.
India had earlier criticised the sanctions as unjustified, with Prime Minister Narendra Modi vowing to protect India's economic interests despite growing pressure. We're once again joined by Jayjit Bhattacharya to discuss this further. We just heard from the US president there, Jayjit. Trump has defended himself by saying these sanctions on India are also already hurting the Russian economy. What are your thoughts on that?
You know, as is well known that it's China which is buying the bulk of Russian oil. And the issue is not just the import of oil, it's import of everything. If you look at the Europeans, they are continuing to import in terms of gas. If you look at the US, their imports from Russia has actually gone up. In fact, in terms of calorific value, the amount of uranium that the US is importing is much more in terms of, as compared to what India has been importing. So if you look at the rule of order, if there is any pattern or logic or rationale, and the rationale is that somehow by stopping imports from Russia, one will curtail the ability of Russia to wage war, then that should start from home. So the US should stop importing uranium straight away. And there should be similar tariffs on China and similar tariffs on the Europe, on EU, on Germany, and so on and so forth. But that hasn't happened. So what we believe after deeper analysis of why these tariffs have been put on India and not on China or EU, or why the US has not stopped its own imports from Russia, is because they can. There is no other logic. They tried to put these tariffs on China. China had the leverage of turning off the flow of rare earth magnets, and that impacted the entire automobile industry of the US. Similarly, they cannot take steps against Germany. They cannot take steps against the other European powers. They can do this with India as of now and get away. Obviously, India has dug in its heels and has said that that's not acceptable as to what US has done. Obviously, it's against the WTO regime. So what's the point in having a rule-based order if the rules are not followed, even though the rules were dictated by the US? So it's a very unfair regime that has come up. And therefore, in that context, it's a little perplexing as to what the US president mentioned in terms of taking action, because these actions are not the relevant actions. There's some action, they're almost a random action, but they're not relevant to the cause of stopping Russia from waging war.
Jayjit Bhattacharya, thank you very much for joining us, and a pleasure to get your analysis on that topic. We stay in the United States for our next story, where a US federal judge has overturned President Donald Trump's decision to cut billions in federal funding to Harvard University, ruling that the action violated the college's First Amendment rights. The court ruling also blocks Trump's administration from stopping existing grants and prevents any further funding freeze. This legal decision follows Trump's accusations of anti-Semitism, radical left ideologies and racial bias at Harvard, which the court has also dismissed, stating that they were not the true basis for implementing funding cuts. Meanwhile, other Ivy League universities, including Columbia, Penn and Brown, have reached deals with the Trump administration to preserve their funding rather than going to the courts. Following the ruling, the White House has announced that it will appeal the decision very soon. In the meantime, Harvard continues to monitor legal developments as it seeks to protect its federal research grants and institutional autonomy. We're now joined by Mark Sutherland, who's a geopolitical expert, and he joins us live from London to discuss this developing situation coming out of Harvard University. Mark, as always, a pleasure to talk to you. Mark, a federal judge has overturned Donald Trump's attempt to cut Harvard's funding, calling it a violation of the First Amendment. How significant is this in the grand scheme of things when it comes to Donald Trump's attitude in terms of left-leaning academic institutions across the United States, where we have seen a tumultuous relationship, to say the least?
Thomas, good to be with you. Again.
Pleasure.
Well, there's a long history of this in regard to Harvard, in regard to Columbia, in regard to Ivy League universities in America during the 20s, early into the early 30s. There were quotas that came in, headed up by the president then Lowell, to then, in regard to Harvard, to then restrict the amount of Jewish students that attended university. Columbia, under Nicholas Murray Butler, that was exactly the same. So there are historic precedents. When a University of Columbia then invites the German ambassador Hans Luther in 1933 over to address students and the delights of the Nazi regime after book burning of Jewish books and other people that the Nazi regime thought were undesirables. Why is that relevant? What I'm saying is that history, sometimes we say that history may not repeat itself, but it rhymes. And these things are very important to look at. What we've then seen with all the encampments, what we have then seen with the anti-Jewish student rhetoric, of course, with the anti-Israel and the students then protesting, singing from the river to the sea, etc., in regard to Israel and what has been going on in Gaza, without actually knowing so many facts, if I may say, without sounding too cynical. But this is all part of it. And Trump is turning around and saying, no, I am fed up with this. I am fed up with the ideology that's come in to the universities over many years. If we then go back to the 60s, a lot of those revolutionary students that were on the streets in the 60s in America then took another turn and then said, well, we're going to the institutions and we'll become professors within that institutions, and then we'll push ideology. That cannot be denied in America, also in other countries, including in the UK. It's just that many people were not aware of that at the time, have now very much woken up to this. It is going to be a little bit of a battle within the courts. That's how the American system then works. But the Trump administration, and of course, remember, his daughter converted to the Jewish faith. His daughter is married to Jared Kushner, a Jewish man. So these also have a personal element within that, Thomas.
Wouldn't critics say that personal element is political, Mark? When it comes to putting sanctions and restricting free speech, as some would say, when it comes to the universities, some people say this is completely political. Of course, the court has dismissed the fact that Donald Trump said there was rampant anti-Semitism and also radical left ideology there. They have dismissed this. What are your thoughts on that, Mark?
Of course, free speech, number one, is extremely important within America, and should actually be very important within the UK. But that's another subject. But the key is this: is that when it turns into violence against Jewish students, when Jewish students are physically being stopped to go into their tutor rooms, when they are then in those tutor rooms, then being invaded by students singing from the river to the sea, etc. Hear me. I'm not saying that people are not allowed to have their opinions. Of course they then are, but unfortunately, when it crosses a line, when it is physical, when it crosses a line, when it is obvious that the ideology, their left-wing thinking is saying, no, we want to get rid of a country, we don't agree with this, but also then undermining the tenets of what America actually then stands for within its constitution. But yes, free speech is extremely important, but it's then how in certain places, then how that is then said, because advocating any violence is wrong. But as people have found, including myself, when you are trying to then debate people who then have that different opinion, especially in regard to Israel and the whole Gaza conflict, is that very often on the other side, people will not listen. It's a drowning out, and people find facts very hard to deal with. The Jewish students are there paying a heck of a lot of money to attend those Ivy League universities. They have a right to do that. They also have a right to their opinions, and that also needs to be protected. But for many years, we have then seen an ideology that is communist, that is socialist, that is then wanting a revolution, which completely undermines what America then stands for. And we have to remember how America was then formed from persecution. But Thomas, sorry.
That's all right, Mark. Thank you very much for joining us. You are staying with us to discuss further United States updates. US President Donald Trump has defended a military strike on a vessel from Venezuela that killed 11 people, claiming that the boat was carrying massive amounts of illegal drugs. Let's listen in to what he said.
Venezuela's been a very bad actor. They've been, as you know, they've been sending millions of people into our country, many of them Tren de Aragua, some of the worst gangs, some of the worst people anywhere in the world in terms of gangs. And we had some in Washington, D.C. We took care of them very quickly, but they're out of here. They've gone. But Venezuela's been very bad, both in terms of drugs and sending some of the worst criminals anywhere in the world into our country.
This U.S. strike on Venezuelan's boat comes amid heightened U.S. military presence in the southern Caribbean, with warships deployed to target narco-terrorist groups. Moreover, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has confirmed that similar operations against drug cartels will continue as part of a broad effort to disrupt trafficking routes. Let's listen in to what he said.
Interdiction doesn't work because these drug cartels, what they do is they know they're going to lose, 2% of their cargo. They bake it into their economics. What will stop them is when you blow them up, when you get rid of them. So they were designated as what they are. They are narco-terrorist organizations. So the same information and the same intelligence mechanisms with maybe a higher focus was used to determine that a drug boat was headed towards eventually the United States. And instead of interdicting it on the president's orders,
Meanwhile, Venezuela's Interior Minister Diosdado Cabello has condemned the strike, calling it an illegal massacre and a violation of international law. Let's listen in to his statements.
Lo que Estados Unidos presentó como un golpe contra narcos no es más que una masacre ilegal en aguas internacionales. Violaron el derecho internacional, violaron sus propias leyes y lo más grave, violaron un principio humano elemental, el derecho a la vida. Esto no fue justicia, fue barbarie.
Additionally, Venezuela's opposition leader, Henrique Capriles, has demanded clarity on the number and nationalities of those killed. This incident has escalated tensions between the United States and Venezuela, coming at a time of increased US focus on regional drug trafficking and political pressure on Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. We are once again joined by Mark Sutherland to discuss this further. Mark, Donald Trump, in his Trump 2.0 term, seems to have found a new enemy, one of them being drug cartel members from south of the border, mainly from Venezuela. He cited Tren de Agua in his statements there. What are your thoughts and analysis on Donald Trump's and his administration's actions when it comes to striking boats in international waters, and also how the international community might respond to this and the problems which might come through due to it?
Previous leader of Hugo Chavez, there is a long history there of these. We've had Hezbollah, Hamas are involved down there in regard to smuggling drugs. So there's terrorist organizations that do that, and Trump has turned around and then taken this very extremely seriously. I meant to say Hugo Chavez. So the shooting and sinking of this particular boat is actually, as someone who said who's been involved in this kind of thing for 30 years, has just turned around, and Maltz has turned around and said, well, this needed to happen. Remember, within the context over the last 4 years under the Biden administration, they've seen millions and millions of illegal aliens go over the border in Mexico. The Mexican cartels are then running drugs, fentanyl. They then have been running that at the top through Canada into America. There is a huge drug problem that the President Trump wants to address, and also to then address the fact that when you have a president of a country, in regard to Venezuela, the accusations of who is then based there. There is a corridor, I think, of Argentina, Paraguay, Brazil, where it's these three corners where they then seek to smuggle drugs into America to then raise money for their terrorist activities. There is a long history of this. We have articles back in 2016 and just before that talking about this. So for terrorist organizations around the world, this has been a way of actually then raising money for their cause. Now, to some, people would turn around and go, well, this seems a bit extreme. Well, the way the Trump administration views this is as an attack on America, the attack on the fabric of America, and they are turning around and saying, we do not want these drugs in our country. What drugs do, as we know, the decimation that it actually brings to civilians, to people that then get caught up in that is dreadful. And so he sees it two ways. One is against the attack on his country, and also with actually they then using that to finance terrorism around the world, and that is also a concern of his. Thomas.
Mark, thank you very much. As always, pleasure having you on the program, and thank you for taking the time. We now come to an end to this hour, and that is all that we have time for, but we will continue to bring you more news updates from around the world. Thank you for joining us.